Hello, this is Dr. Newman. Welcome to the second part of our opening lecture on Old English culture and civilization, and particularly on the Christianization of the pagan Anglo-Saxon people. And in this video, we're going to talk about the oldest surviving piece of Old English poetry, and it comes out of the fusion of Germanic warrior culture and poetry with Christian theology. And that is reported to us by one of the most important people in the Western world in the first millennium. And that is a man known as Bede, or sometimes the Venerable Bede. He was beatified by the Catholic Church. He lived between 673 and 735 or thereabouts. Accurate records weren't really being kept very often then. He was a monk at the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow. That's in eastern England. He wrote a huge amount of work. He's considered he's the author of many theological works and biblical commentaries. He is the author of the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed 731. That is one of our most important sources of knowledge about Britain in between the fall of the Roman Empire and the establishment of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Most of the best information we have about the period of the so-called invasions or migrations of the Anglo-Saxon people come from this scholar and monk Bede. Like most monks and most learned people, really, up until the 18th century, he wrote in Latin. Latin was continued to be the universal language of religion and scholarship in Western Europe long after the Roman Empire fell. He wrote this history in order to illustrate God's providence. In other words, to demonstrate how the invasion of Britain by the Anglo-Saxons was all part of God's plan. He tells a story about an Anglo slave boy being sold in a Roman market, and Pope Gregory the Great is walking along with an assistant of his, and he sees this beautiful blonde boy. And he says, "What manner of person is that?" And the slave dealer says, "Oh, that's an Angle, or an Anglos in Latin." He says, "Non Angli sed angeli," not an Englishman, but an angel, he says. So beautiful. He says, Are they saved? Are they part of the church? And they go, no, they're pagans. He said, "Oh, we got to convert them." So he sends people up to convert them, and Christianity gets slowly established among them. We'll talk a bit more about that. But this is a story that's told by Bede as the beginning of the church in England. And Bede wrote as I said, he wrote many biblical commentaries and theological works. He's one of the doctors of the church, that is the Catholic Church. And one of only 36. They include Jerome, Augustine, Aquinas, Hildegard of Bingen, and so Bede's a pretty significant figure. And he's important for those who study early English poetry because he records one of the oldest bits of Old English poetry, and that is Cadmon's hymn, which was written sometime between 658 and 680. It is the earliest extant Old English poem. That is to say, it's not the first Old English poem. Old English was used before Cadmon, and they had a tradition of oral formulaic poetry. Oral formulaic poetry is poetry that is sort of built out of these Lego pieces of language. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey also have the characteristics of oral formulaic poetry, where bits of language, rosy-fingered dawn, wily Odysseus, many-towered Troy, are put together. These phrases are locked together like a bit of Lego bricks that you keep together to build something bigger. They're called formulas, and they're meant to aid memory and to and you can combine and vary the formulas to construct whole stories out of them. Beowulf is oral formulaic poetry. most Old English poetry is. And it has an alliterative meter, which means that the lines of poetry are stuck together. Their organizing principle is that each line will have several consonant sounds that alliterate with each other. This image here is from a very early manuscript from 737 of the Ecclesiastical History that has Bede himself translated it into England, but that written in the margin is the English poetry of it. And now let's look at that poem itself. One thing you're going to be surprised to see is just what Old English is like. This on the left here is Old English. And this is what it sounds like. Nu shilun hergon, heaven richas word, metudas makti and his moldgi thank. Verk vulder fader sway he wundragi hwas, etchi dryktin. Or astavidai he arrest shop elda barnum, heaven til hrofa, haleg shepen, the midun yerd, mon kinas ward, etchi dryktin after tiadai, firum foldu, freya almektig. That's it. That's the whole thing. That's Cadmon's hymn, and that is Old English. Shakespeare is not Old English. Old English is so different from modern English that it is basically a foreign language. If you look carefully through here, you might see words that you recognize. Can you see any? We'll discuss that in class. But we can see heaven, riches, vard. Vard is related to ward, like warden, so he's the guardian of heaven. And riches there, that root there, R-I-C, rich, is related to the German word Reich, as in kingdom. So the kingdom of, this is actually the kingdom of heaven's guardian. We can see the word shop here, S-C-O-P. He arst shop, the first creator, the holy creator. The word shop is related to the word shape, as in to make a shape or to shape something. This also, by the way, in Old English poetry, is the word for a poet. So there is a translation of Christian ideas of creation. In Greek, the word poesis is used to describe God's creation of the universe. And so that is changed or translated into this Germanic word, shop, linking again the idea of poetic creation with the God's creation of the world. And this was Cadmon's hymn. Now we must honor the guardian of heaven, the might of the architect and his purpose, the work of the Father of glory, as he, the eternal Lord, established the beginning of wonders. He, the holy creator, first created heaven as roof for the children of men, then the guardian of mankind, the eternal Lord, the Lord Almighty, afterwards appointed the middle earth, the lands for men. Now what is this? Why does Bede include this? What is the context? Who is Cadmon? Well, the story goes like this. Bede is describing how there were a group of cowherds, of cattle herds, cowboys, I guess we might say, and they were all sort of hanging out by the fire one night, and they were keeping themselves busy by taking turns writing poetry. And they would do this every night, and not writing poetry, but reciting poetry and making up songs in this oral formulaic pattern. And a lot of these poems would have recounted tales of ancient heroes from pre-Christian times and dragon slayers like Sigmund and heroes like Beowulf. And Cadmon, whenever it came to Cadmon's turn to sing or to recite a poem, he always like, no, I'm tired, I'm going to bed now. And he would go off and go to sleep. And one night he had a dream that an angel put a coal in his mouth and said, tomorrow you will sing. And the next day, to everybody's surprise, he busted out with this. And he adapted the ancient Germanic Anglo-Saxon way of making poetry to a Christian message and a Christian purpose that is discussing God's creation of the world and glorifying God for it. So that's called Cadmon's hymn. And this is part of Bede's ecclesiastical history because it shows a miracle of God making Christians out of the English people and adapting English culture to Christianity. It's an old story that Christianity adapts to the cultures that it finds, that the message is not necessarily specific to one culture. Otherwise, we'd be speaking Greek now, wouldn't we? But no, this was kind of an interesting story, and it's striking, and it is the oldest bit of Anglo-Saxon poetry that we have. Now, scholars of English literature in previous generations get kind of annoyed that the oldest Old English poetry that we have is in fact not Christian, because they sort of think about the Germanic peoples who came to England in terms of this idea of original authenticity and purity, that before it was sort of hybridized by a Mediterranean Christian culture. There was, especially in the 19th century, a real desire to get at knowledge of the Germanic peoples before they were influenced by Greek, Roman, Hebrew civilization. But here's the thing. Literacy came with Christianity. All pagan literature is refracted through a Christian perspective. And of course, the Christian perspective often conflicts with the ancient heroic ethos of pre-Christian Germanic culture, which valued glory, desire for recognition, blood feuds, eagerness for fame. That's all not very, very Christian, is it? I mean, in Christianity, in Galatians, in Paul's letter to Galatians, he writes, "God forbid that I should boast about anything or anybody except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, which means that the world is dead to me, and I am a dead man to the world. May I never boast except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, through which the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world." Those are two different translations of the same line. Old English heroic literature is all about boasting and winning. It's the monastic tradition of Christianity in which you're supposed to die to the world. To be a monk is to die to the world, to be born to the kingdom of heaven. The monastery is supposed to recreate the kingdom of heaven on earth. So how do you go about converting a people who have such different values? Well, you find a halfway point. You sort of blend. You sort of find what is in their culture already and look for the correspondences in it. And this is an example of that we see in Cadmon's hymn. Here's another bit from Bede's ecclesiastical history of the English people. And this is describing the words of a missionary who went to the pagan king Edwin of Northumbria. The missionary went and tried to describe to him why he should be Christian. And I'm going to play this little video here, and that's going to show you, it's a video somebody made of Anglo-Saxon, the mead hall, the hall that a kingdom would live in, and have feasts and entertain people. And it's the image of this hall, the mead hall. Mead was a alcoholic drink made out of honey. That was the most commonly drank beverage among the Anglo-Saxons. And these are the words of the missionary to Edwin. "The present life of man upon earth, O king, seems to me in comparison with that time which is unknown to us, like the swift flight of a sparrow through a mead hall, where you sit at supper in winter, with your eldermen and thanes, while the fire blazes in the midst and the hall is warmed. but the wintry storms of rain or snow are raging abroad. The sparrow, flying in at one door and immediately out at another, whilst he is within, that was a cow, is safe from the wintry tempest, but after a short space of fair weather, he immediately vanishes out of your sight, passing from winter to winter again. So this life of man appears for a little while, but of what is to follow, or what went before, we know nothing at all. If, therefore, this new doctrine tells us something more certain, it seems justly to be followed in our kingdom. So when we get together in class, I'd like to ask a few questions about, I'd like to discuss a few things about Cadmon's hymn. What is the relationship between the human and divine in Cadmon's hymn? How does it imagine that relationship? What kind of social or familial relationship is imagined between God and mankind in Cadmon's hymn? I'll talk a bit more also about the difference between Christian ethics and the heroic code, and that'll be sort of preparing us to discuss both the elegies and Beowulf. Looking forward to it. See ya.